Welcome to this February edition of the Australian-New Zealand Women's Declaration International webinar. My name is Janet Fraser and I'm a volunteer with the Feminist Legal Clinic in Exile. Our principal solicitor, Anna Kerr, is doing tech with Kate Williamson, so thanks to those women. I live and work on Darug and Gundungurra Nurra outside of Sydney. Wherever you're coming from this evening, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations across this continent. We also pay our respects to the women and children in Ukraine as war breaks out. And in tonight's webinar, we'll be dealing with Articles 4 and 5. Article 4 is about freedom of opinion and expression. Women have the right to hold opinions without interference. This should include the right to hold and express opinions about gender identity without being subject to harassment, prosecution, or punishment. And Article 5, women have a right to peaceful assembly and freedom of association. This should include the right to assemble and associate based on their sex. Lesbians should also have a right to assemble and associate on the basis of their sexual orientation. Women's assemblies and associations should not have to include men who claim to have female gender identities. Eilean Haley lives on Wongal land and is a veteran of the women's liberation movement of the 1970s, a retired public servant, a translator, Spanish to English, a poet, an aspiring novelist, and a quilter. Chris Sitka lives on Wurundjeri land. She is a graduate of gay liberation, women's liberation, radical lesbians, and a lifelong activist since the 1960s when she began opposing the war on Vietnam and apartheid before going on. She is currently a member of the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, Matrix Guild Victoria, and the Women's Guild Victoria, which oppose the attack on women's and lesbians' rights. M is our anonymous speaker tonight. She is a radical feminist from India who is currently based in Australia. She is interested in studying the application of radical feminist theory to countries of the global south, like India. She has been a radical feminist for 5 years. She will cover Article 4 of the Declaration, with a focus on India and the patterns of censoring and harassment of women in Australia, India, and the UK. And last but not least, our fourth speaker, Vivian Morrigan, lives on Wongal country. She retired from her last full-time job as a lecturer at the University of Queensland Ipswich campus, where she was responsible for setting up and running courses on the cultural studies of science and technology within the Centre for Contemporary Studies. She first became politicised in her early 30s when she became involved in women's action against global violence, a member of the national umbrella group Women for Survival, and while carrying out postgraduate work at the University of Sydney. Soon after, she was elected the first women's officer for their postgrad association. It was during this time that she committed herself to a lesbian feminist identity, which she has maintained passionately and proudly since. She is the Secretary and Public Officer of COAL, the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, and a member of L40, a social group for lesbians in New South Wales. She is also a contributor to the radical feminist book critiquing porn bots, sex robots, due for publication.
I am speaking this evening on land stolen from the Wongal people, a land that was among the first to bear the brunt of British invasion, land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am going to talk to you about the work of Women's Cooee to ABC. Now, the ABC, that's their logo there, is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The ABC's like the BBC, although unlike the BBC, its main source of funding is directly from the government, in other words, us taxpayers. The ABC's board is government appointed, but it has a charter enshrined in legislation that is intended to ensure that the ABC operates independently of the government of the day. Now, the is huge, absolutely huge. It's got free-to-air TV stations, it's got heaps of radio stations, it's got online services, it's got extensive programming of all sorts for the general public and also specifically for children. It's very venerable in Australian terms. It dates back to 1932 and is much beloved, being affectionately nicknamed Auntie. As well as having a charter, the ABC's also got editorial standards and a code of practice meant to ensure that it reports factual material accurately and deals with issues impartially and with balance. It's often accused of bias, usually by conservatives and other right-wingers. Some recent controversies have been about support for same-sex marriage, the inappropriateness of our national day, Australia Day, being the date of the 1788 British invasion, child sex abuse by Catholic clergy, and climate change and environmental issues more generally. But we feminist defenders of women's sex-based rights accuse the ABC of bias too, and rightly so, because rarely a day goes by that the ABC doesn't promote men in women's spaces or child transition in its children's programming, as well as its current affairs and lifestyle programs. It's everywhere. It's been recently described as doing pro bono PR for the trans lobby. And really, that's an accurate description, leaving many of us tearing our hair out and foaming at the mouth and throwing things at the TV screen. Now, early last year, the heroic and indefatigable Brisbane sisters announced that they were going to protest outside the ABC in Brisbane on the 6th of June and invited women in other cities to do likewise. So we got together in Sydney and did the same. Here we are outside the back entrance to the ABC in Sydney. The banner is a historic relic, as it's the same banner that was present at the Australian launch of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights back in February 2020. It seems a very long time ago now, but it's only 2 years. That event was held at Sydney Uni and it was ferociously disrupted by trans extremists who occupied the podium and harangued and insulted us. So it's good to have the banner out again. Now, the placard displays two of our main demands. It says, break free of trans bias, accusing the ABC, and rightly so, of displaying bias in contravention of its charter, its editorial standards, and its code of practice. The placard also says to the Drum, which is one of the ABC's current affairs programs, which has a panel format, it says, give Holly Lawford-Smith a gig, highlighting that the ABC never or hardly ever has gender-critical spokesperson on any of its shows. This again goes to the ABC's bias, like the thing above. And Holly Lawford-Smith wasn't the only person who we suggested be given a gig on The Drum or on Q+A, which is another such panel current affairs program. From memory, we also put forward Kath Deves of Save Women's Sport Australasia, Janet Fraser, our host this evening, and the Feminist Legal Clinic, also our host this evening. In fact, there are plenty of competent spokeswomen who could go on these panels and never get a gig. As well as the banner and the placards, we also had these ingenious things. Mini posters mounted on skewers that can be stuck into the ground. This is a play school interlude, and for overseas guests, play school is the flagship of ABC children's programming. This is how to make a women's cooey skewer. So you start with a piece of paper like this, and you've got your slogans written on it, and you crease it lengthways like so, and you put glue all over the back, and you get a skewer and you put it like so. And so then you have your skewer. And here is one that I prepared earlier that might be taken as an allusion to Nigella Lawson or to Sylvia's Italian Table, an ABC cookery show, of which there are many as well. I'll talk about a few of the skewers you can see in the pic, as they illustrate a selection of our causes for rage and indignation. We have No Bloke is a Lesbian. The ABC has a half-hour program called You Can't Ask That, which features a group of people who are marginalised or a minority in some way, who answer written questions sourced from the public. The questions are designed to be, or are allowed to be, naively curious, ignorant, even a bit rude. And examples of groups that have featured on You Can't Ask That are people with obsessive compulsive disorder, Chinese Australians, Muslims. So one of the episodes was about lesbians, and they had a panel of 9 lesbians answering the questions. And lo and behold, one of the lesbians in inverted commas, was a bloke. A bloke who talked about how he's still got a penis and gets pleasure from it. Talk about insulting and infuriating. Another skewer, cover the women's resistance. The ABC just ignores important developments like Keira Bell and Tavistock in the UK, or the spate of women's sports bills in state legislatures in the USA, or the City of Sydney kicking the feminist legal clinic out of its premises, or the recent sacking of Karen Licignoli, who was CEO of Girl Guides Western Australia. She was CEO for a week until she raised issues about having boys sleeping in the same tent as girls. And she was out on her neck. The ABC has totally ignored that entire issue. The ABC decides for itself what's newsworthy and what isn't. Newsworthiness not really in the code of practice. So it's not a matter that's even open to complaint from the public. They do have a kind of a complaints process where you can complain about factual accuracy, impartiality, and balance, but newsworthiness is not part of that. Now, another one of the skewers, don't leave it to Murdoch to blow the whistle. Again, this goes to the ABC just ignoring the whole thing. Bernard Lane at the Murdoch newspaper, The Australian, has taken gender ideology on a bit, and so have commentators at Murdoch's Sky News. It's as though the ABC is saying to the Australian public, look, if you're interested in this rubbish, go watch Peter Credlin on Sky News. It's not on. These are important social and political issues, and the ABC should be covering them with quality journalism. And this one, no child is born in the wrong body. Now, the pic here is of Michelle Telfer, who is the head of the gender service at the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne. She is Australia's queen of the puberty blockers, and she is an absolute golden girl at the ABC. It's amazing, it's ridiculous, it's even a bit weird. She's been the star of 3 ABC broadcasts, one on the current affairs program Four Corners in 2014, another on the human interest program Australian Story in May last year, and the third a segment of Media Watch in September last year. And just as an aside, Posy Parker has a very funny send-up of the Australian Story program online, with extra hilarity from Posy's attempt at an Australian accent. Inspired by this first action of ours, we planned another for July, still talking 2021 here, but we had to cancel because of COVID. Our second action was eventually held on the 30th of October last year, and we got our act together a bit more. We prepared a leaflet. Oops, wrong leaflet. Here we are. This is the leaflet in which we presented ourselves as left-leaning feminist women and outlined a lot of our concerns. More of our concerns. Because we couldn't fit everything we wanted to say in the leaflet, we also set up a website with more information and analysis and with a QR code. I thought that was very, very up to date, very, 21st century. Can you see the QR code? Where did I get the QR? There it is, the QR code on the leaflet to direct people to the website. On the website, we highlight that we do support our ABC as a publicly funded broadcaster and support adequate funding for the ABC. Now, that's because we're keen to differentiate ourselves from right-wingers who are forever calling for the ABC to be privatised or defunded. And we also, I'm talking about the lead up to the action on the 30th of October, we also set up a Twitter account with the first tweet happening on the day of our action. Through total serendipity, our October action coincided with Reasons to Riot's Chalk It Day, where Reasons to Riot calls on feminists all around the world to chalk our concerns and our demands. So we chalked too, and you can see that we partly adopted a hopscotch sort of a format, and we even played hopscotch. We also did actions on the 30th of October at both entrances to Sydney's ABC offices, front and back, and this is their front office. Note the security officer lurking in the pot plants. The ABC security did call cops on us that day, but the cops went away after we assured them that we weren't silence is tyranny, apparently a group that the ABC thought were going to descend upon them en masse. And afterwards we went to the pub for lunch. There aren't many of us doing these actions. We're quite diverse, generationally speaking, sexual orientation-wise, even country of origin-wise. And we weren't a bunch of mates who all knew one another before we started doing this. So we have come to know each other mainly through doing this action. So social interaction has been important for us to consolidate as a group, as well as enjoyable in itself. So we've had two further actions, one on the 27th of November last year and the latest just 2 weeks ago on the 12th of February. This is from the action in November last year. The skewers, you will see, have donned suffragist colours. You'll observe we've got purple, green, different shades of green, and white. And the slogan has changed. In our first actions, the slogan was break free of trans bias, to be unbiased being a requirement of the ABC Code of Practice and editorial standards. But now we've changed it to break free of trans lobby and have included the logo of ACON. Now, again, for overseas guests, ACON is Australia's equivalent of Stonewall, and indeed it acknowledges that it has based its activities on Stonewall's. ACON has evolved into a trans juggernaut that runs these schemes that corporations and government agencies sign up to, and ACON delivers ratings on how good they are at enforcing gender ideology in their workplaces. The ABC has a gold employer rating with ACON and won an ACON award for its Instagram platform, ABC Queer, which is a youth-targeted platform. I'm not on Instagram, so I can't talk a lot about it, but it looks dreadful, actually. Now, the change in our slogan reflects a growing consciousness among us, well, in me in particular, that much of the ABC's fanatical adherence to gender ideology can be laid at the door of its membership of ACON. And of course, a few weeks before we did this action, the BBC ditched its trans lobby Stonewall. And we reference that on the skewers, as you can see, the idea being that if the BBC ditched its trans lobby, the ABC could do the same. This is a chalking from our action 2 weeks ago, our latest action, again focusing on the ABC's membership of ACON. ABC silences legitimate criticism to win trans lobby ACON's gold star. A feature of our chalking this time was that a number of the texts we chalked were based on suggestions from members of gender-critical Facebook groups, and this is one such. We're a tiny group. There are lots of reasons why more people can't join the actions, but there are a lot of people who do support us and wish us well, and this is a way they can take part. So we asked them to suggest slogans for us. Our actions have been held at the weekend because some of us can't make it during the week. So there hasn't been a lot of contact with the public just because there's not a lot of people going back and forth around the ABC offices at the weekend. But we have had some interactions, some hostile and some, as in this case, sympathetic. I wouldn't say we've been successful. We haven't changed ABC content or mobilised thousands of people to clamour at the ABC's door for change, but street action is a good thing to have in our repertoire of activism. By we, I mean us, defenders of women's sex-based rights. And this has been our modest contribution so far. So more or less in conclusion, the ABC is taxpayer funded. The ABC has an obligation to independence, integrity, responsibility, factual accuracy and impartiality. It's simply not living up to those obligations as regards women and children. We have a right, indeed an obligation, to call out the ABC on this, and we're doing it. So Articles 4 and 5 of the Declaration assert women's right to association and expression. Women's Kui 2 ABC actions are an example of women's association and expression, and the current circumstances are an illustration of why it is necessary to exercise such faculties in these very strange times.
And I would like to ask our next speaker if she would step up. Chris Sitka, over to you.
I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. And I'm going to talk to you today about one of the organisations I'm involved in, which is the Victorian Women's Guild. I haven't got lots of lovely visuals like Eilean did, so you'll just have to put up with looking at me while I talk. A group of us noticed in 2019 that the Victorian government was about to introduce the Victorian Births, Deaths and Marriages Bill, the self-ID bill. So that would allow any person to go in and just simply change their so-called sex, change it, and say they were another sex or gender, whatever word they use. And we decided that this needed some opposition. So we got together and had a meeting and discussed what ways we could lobby and campaign around this. And we decided we should have a name because we thought that if we were an organisation, we might be listened to more and get further than if we were just, an amorphous collection of individuals. So we came up with the name Victorian Women's Guild. And one of the reasons was we thought it sounded quite conservative. And so that when we approached politicians, they might actually pay attention to us before they realised we were really radical feminists. That kind of disguise didn't last very long, I can tell you, because once the media got a hold of it, they exposed us as being turfy. And so anyway, it didn't matter because it's quite good because in medieval times, guilds got together to, when they had a similar craft, and our craft is defending women's rights. So it is, good that it's a guild. And so having a group identity like that, I think has served us well in all our lobbying and campaigning and that. So we established a web page. We've got a Twitter handle and a Facebook page, and I can put those up on the chat later if people want to take a look. And our website's particularly good and very comprehensive, and it has a lot of information on it, all the campaigns, media releases, submissions, very good resource page, and different articles. For example, I wrote a long spiel on the threats to lesbians from the trans lobbies. And so I think it's well worth having a look at. So when we first opposed the self-ID bill, we did a lot of things, really. We did so much, we actually completely exhausted ourselves. We were only a fairly small group. I think there were about 8 of us at the first meeting. But other women came on board and worked with us against this bill. And as well as lobbying the politicians, we organised a public meeting. So we had a big public meeting, and Holly Lawford-Smith organised to get a space for us at Melbourne University. And we had, I can't remember the exact number of attendants, but it was, at least 100 or more. And so that was the people who came to hear our speakers. We had 4 speakers. Bronwyn came down from Sydney. Holly spoke. And anyway, we had a big demonstration against us because the trans activists heard about it, and they tried to book out all the seats because we had, booking online, but we were onto them. So we unbooked a lot of them because we knew some of the names they were using and if they were booking big blocks. Anyway, we weren't trying to totally exclude them, but we weren't going to let them book us out. So they all turned up, 100, and they all stood outside trying to intimidate everyone who was coming in to our meeting. We had security guards provided by the university. And I think some people who came to attend were intimidated and did go home, but most of our attendees were fairly robust and got through that. And I was one of the security guards. Like at one point when everyone went into the meeting, I was still thinking they might rampage in and kind of, disrupt the meeting. And the actual security guards disappeared. So Kathy and I stood around in the foyer, and apparently we're very scary, known to be TERFs, that, very dangerous. So they seem to be scared, and some of them come through the door and we just look at them and they go back out on the street. So we only had one cheeky guy who sort of harassed us, but he didn't. Anyway, we had a few of their supporters in the meeting, but the meeting went along quite civilly, and we had all the speakers and there was some discussion, including with some people who'd come in there who were anti our message, but we still had a civil discussion with them. So it was an interesting public meeting. We've then the next we've lobbied a lot of politicians, and one of the things I think is interesting to note is when we'd go to see them, they'd say to us, we've already been lobbied several times by the trans lobby, which made me realise how well funded they are and how well people to be going around to lobby politicians, not once, but the same politicians several times, whereas here was us doing it all voluntarily, getting a little group to see the politician. Was a big effort on our part, and we didn't get to see all of them. But and I think one of the surprising things for me is that a couple of members from the Liberal Party became very supportive of us. And as an old lefty, that was kind of shocking to me, that the Labor Party was, very against us, but there was a woman in the Liberal Party called Louise Staley who turned out to be much more radical than I imagined a Liberal Party deputy leader to be as far as feminism goes. She was totally on board with us, and she told us she was a radical feminist. She probably has a slightly different definition to me, but anyway, she did support us. She offered to hire a room in Parliament House for us to meet with politicians. We didn't eventually do that, but she and the deputy, the Shadow Attorney General actually came to our public meeting. So that did all help give us quite a profile, and we got a fair bit of press coverage of our opposition to the bill. Of course, the bill was passed. We know they've already done a lot of work beforehand, and I could see some of their professional lobbyists in there talking to the Labor politicians when I was in Parliament lobbying. The politicians who would see us, no Labor members would agree to see us anyway, once they realised who we were. So we continued with the group. Look, it's been a small group, and members change. We get women coming along, being very enthusiastic, proposing that we do things, and then they sort of suddenly say they're too busy with their life and disappear. So we've only got 3 members who've continually come to meetings. We have monthly meetings and we talk of ideas. Our next, that was our biggest kind of campaign right at the start. But then when the Victorian government decided they would do the change in suppression conversion bill, which was about, was marketed as benefiting gays and lesbians, that's all you ever heard about it in the press and them talking, to stop, the religious people trying to convert gays and lesbians away from, their sexuality. But the underlying thing that wasn't sold on to the general public was that you couldn't oppose trans people deciding to transition. And we felt that it was I felt it was an anti-lesbian bill because it disallows us. For example, if I talk to a young woman who says, oh, I don't know if I'm lesbian or trans, and I say, well, try being lesbian. Well, apparently I'm converting her away from trans. And there is a penalty of up to 10 years, would you believe, imprisonment for this action, which is quite shocking, really. And it's also forbids psychologists, teachers, anyone from doing anything other than affirming a trans person. So it's quite a serious penalty and serious legislation. And so we did put in submissions against that. We lobbied about it, probably not as much as the other bill because we just didn't have the same level of support from, women willing to do it, but we did have some. And of course that went through. As well as that, the Victorian Women's Guild participates in a lot of any campaign that comes up, like when the Women's Legal Clinic was threatened, Coogee Women's Pool. We made a submission to the UN Status of Women. We made a submission to Tasmania when they started talking about having their own conversion bill, which hasn't gone ahead yet. So we... And we're fairly informal, and if someone comes and joins the group and they have a passion to write a letter about a certain thing, We just, you can just go ahead and do it and use the Victorian Women's Guild, as long as it's, within our radical feminist framework, which our members tend to be. We can do that. And so we have got a bit of a profile, which I think is good. We try to let the press know that they can contact us and talk to us about things, but they don't very often. We do get letters published in the paper. And actually, if you go onto our page on our website and see the summary of the things we've done, our achievements, it's quite remarkable how much we've done for a very small group that is totally volunteer, totally unfunded. And actually, we were sort of very noticeable when that first self-ID bill happened, and people were contacting us and asking if they could be members, but we hadn't actually created a membership list, or how we hadn't decided how we would do that. And then we just all ran out of puff because we were all working like many hours a day, opposing the self-ID bill, and we just didn't have the energy left and the numbers to create a membership and all the work that entails. So I guess that's still possible as something to do. We did have someone come along and say, we could get funding. She had a plan for how we could get funding and everything, but then she left the group, so that hasn't happened. So I guess, the two things about the Victorian Women's Guild is that we've done a tremendous amount of work, and I think we've been fairly effective, and we're fairly popular with people who oppose the trans agenda and do get in contact with us. But we're also limited by the fact that we haven't got enough members, and we're tends to be mostly older women and who've been campaigning for a long time and have more limited, energy. And it would be really good if we could get young women to, participate and join and put their energy into it and build it a bit. But that doesn't seem to be happening. We do have really nice food at our meetings. If there's anyone in Victoria who'd like to come when we have a meeting, we have one member in particular who just brings so much, enough food for about 2 or 3 times as many women as come. So that's a good thing about real life meeting, as opposed to just campaigning on the web, that you can get to know each other and have a nice chat and have a nice feed together, which is terrific. So that's become my main group for the campaigning around these issues, and it's been a very pleasant one. And so I encourage anybody who just does campaigning via social media to form a group like this, because even if it is small, you can do a lot. And I think it's really important to meet in real life. So I'll leave it at that, and you can ask questions if you like, and do have a look particularly at our webpage, because we've got a very good web mistress who has done a great job for, like we say, everything we do is voluntary.
And now I would like to introduce our anonymous speaker. We have M, a radical feminist from India who's just arrived in Australia. Take it away, M.
I would like to humbly and respectfully acknowledge the First Nations and their people and pay my tributes to elders past, present, and emerging. So I will focus on both Article 4 and 5 of the Declaration. Article 4 is about reaffirming the right of women to freedom of opinion and freedom of expression, and Article 5 is about the freedom of women to associate and assemble. Now because I'm going to cover India, Australia, and the UK, I just want to begin by setting the socio-legal context so that we can understand the broader the background under which women are being persecuted, because we are being persecuted. Now, when you look at India, Australia, and the UK, all 3 of these countries have one common legal tradition. That is the legal tradition of common law that originated in the UK. Now, since all three countries are democracies, they consider the right to free speech and expression to be crucial to the existence of functioning democracy. The right to free speech, and when it comes to India, the right to free speech is a fundamental right, which means that every Indian citizen, which includes women, is entitled to the exercise of this right. Now so these are the legal rights, and women are entitled to say what they want to. So that includes the right of academics like Dr. Kathleen Stock to write her book and to express her thoughts on gender identity. That includes the right of an Indian filmmaker like Vaishnavi Sundar to make her films and to express her opinions. But as women, we live under male supremacy, and for centuries, men have censored, shut up, or persecuted women for speaking and articulating, such that our voices are lost. It happened to suffragists in the UK in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as well. And it continues to happen to women in homes, offices, and parliaments. Even when women are given a platform to speak, such as academia or political forums and mass media, what we say is not taken seriously. If women are saying that men in women's bathroom is a safety emergency, it's not being taken seriously. Women do not set trends, intellectual, political, or otherwise. It's because women don't lead the conversations by expressing. Now, focusing on India, the cult of gender identity has made significant encroachments in India. We already have a statute in place which allows individuals and minors to declare their gender. One is not likely to find any op-ed, editorial, or news piece which does not use language which subscribes to gender identity. Pronouns, trans woman, anti-trans, it's all there. I realized early on in my journey as a radical feminist that there is a culture of intolerance around anyone who questioned the transgender. In 2017, when I was on Twitter, I used to follow other radical feminists, particularly in the UK, who are fighting to protect their women only spaces, like bathrooms. I commented in support of one such feminist on Twitter, but some of my woke Indian followers were not happy about it. So I got a very rhetorical comment, question, and response, something to the effect of, I don't understand, is this about trans women not being able to enter women's bathrooms? So, I mean, the question was so rhetorical that I chose not to respond to it. However, I found that soon my comment was getting retweeted around such that some trans identified men could see it and then identify who I was. Come to 2022, and we already have many cases of women who have been deplatformed, fired, forced to resign, or have been bullied and harassed by genderists and their supporters in all the three countries and many more, of course, uh, for stating the plain truth that sex is real and immutable. The late Kamla Bhasin, a long-time Indian feminist, was reviled and called a TERF on social media and otherwise by genderists in India for not pandering to the trans agenda to their satisfaction. Vaishnavi Sundar, an Indian filmmaker and a fearless radical feminist, has been cancelled by most of the Indian media. Her film Dysphoric, which is available on YouTube, has been treated as if it was never made by the mainstream Indian media here. She has lost writing gigs, and people will not review her work. But there is one more tactic that is used to silence feminists who question gender identity in India, which is to call them elitist, bigots, or exclusionary. That by saying men cannot become women, feminists are somehow defending other forms of oppression along the lines of caste or class. So, as for compelled speech, such as the use of pronouns and being compelled to use words like trans women or pronouns, there are young therapists in India who have psychotherapists who have started to use pronouns to describe themselves. Harry Potter is very famous and beloved in India. When J.K. Rowling tweeted in support of Maya Forstater in 2020, the woke brigade in India set out on a witch hunt. Indian woke could not and still cannot wrap their heads around the fact that a woman did not toe the line of men's feelings. The fact that women like me have to do this anonymously every time that we want to speak or interact with our sisters also speaks to the medieval culture of witch hunting that gender identity relies on. It is not that we cannot have a conversation, but I think that the trans rights movement does not want to have a conversation with women. There are women like me and my other feminists who have been shouted down and simply kicked out of events and webinars discussing the rights of queer identifying people here in India for asking basic questions like about biology and about stating the plain truth that men cannot become women just by feeling that they are women. Whereas feminists, we are constantly articulating, justifying, and re-justifying our position, responding to criticism levied on us, especially on radical feminists, running pillar to post, collecting data, fighting lawsuits, making websites, doing surveys to substantiate and corroborate what should have been pretty obvious in the first place. Gender identity has and continues to flourish in an environment which has completely chilled speech, women's speech to be exact. The silence of women is essential to the furthering of the transgender, so that men can continue to fetishize us and enter our spaces. It works on the logic of no body, no crime. But there are two other factors that have shaped this environment, in my opinion. One, the fact that women are not considered credible. In institutions and otherwise across cultures that we're talking about, be it a country of the global south like India, be it the UK, be it America, be it Canada, be it Australia, women generally are not considered credible. What we say has to be corroborated, has to be substantiated, and it has to be specially corroborated by a man. The misogyny that is embedded in our societies and the complete disappearance of any critical inquiry on concepts like gender, sex, and male supremacy in academia. Had academia not lost its ground on these issues, and had it stuck to serious and sincere investment in inquiring into the condition of women, we would have been able to see the fetishization in the behavior of men who claim to be women. I also want to emphasize that there is no end to which women's freedom to think and to express and to articulate can be curtailed in this current regime of gender identity, because it demands a total surrender from women of any freedom to say anything. So it is naive to think that by imitating the positive messages like trans women are women, trans women can be lesbians, women would be protected from harm. Well, the only way forward that I can imagine for women like me who belong to developing countries like India, and for women who belong to more developed countries like the UK is to just go on speaking and defending our right to disagree and our right to oppose the fetishization and the dehumanization that is inherent with gender identity. Thank you.
And our last but not least speaker is Vivian Morrigan. So if you're ready, Vivian, I'd like to turn it over to you.
I live on unceded Wongal Eora land, otherwise known as Leichhardt. So WDI's Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights aims to reaffirm women's sex-based rights as set out in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 18th of December 1979, a little more than 42 years ago, and a more developed version adopted in the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women in 1993, 29 years ago. You can see I like history. In 2018, barely 4 years ago, the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights was written by UK-based Maureen O'Hara, Sheila Jeffries, and Heather Brunksall Evans, who founded the Women's Human Rights Campaign, WHRC, now the WDI, with Joe Brew. It's really important to me to acknowledge all these women who've done such wonderful work for women. Their aim was to counter the alarming rise of gender ideology that was undermining these basic and hard-fought-for women's rights. In a short time, this small band of women has been pivotal in re-establishing a vibrant international feminist network and community of radical feminists keen to speak up and act to further women's liberation. They certainly have inspired me. MDI's online declaration and regular webinars, such as this one, are an exciting feminist and technological intervention that Andrea Noboa, and I'm not sure if I've pronounced that correctly, a Brazilian journalist and writer, and women and children's rights advocate, has likened to, quote, a modern implementation of the consciousness raising programs of the 1960s. And I agree with her entirely. Today, we focus on the Declaration's Articles 4 and 5 that reaffirm women's rights to freedoms of opinion and expression and peaceful assembly and association. I'd like to recount tonight examples of how these rights have been undermined for lesbians and other women in Australia as a result of gender ideology, the new patriarchal weapon of the men's rights movement. So firstly, freedom of opinion and expression. An example is no platforming, happening all around the world, but in Australia, some examples that I've come across are Carolyn Norma, who was removed from the list of speakers at an academic conference in Sydney because of her gender critical views. In Melbourne, Reading's Bookshop apologised for holding a book launch for Julie Bindel when a person complained about her gender critical views 3 years later after the event. And even this, I came upon this today, the lesbian YouTuber Ariel Scarcella, whose politics I share little in common with, was banned when she tried to visit from the US to join a Sydney Mardi Gras discussion panel in 2020. This was when she identified with the LGBT community, but did not accept that men who identify as trans women are women. Another example is of problems with us being robbed of our freedom of opinion and expression is the cancelling of social media accounts. Holly Lawford Smith, for example, but there are many, many others that I know of in the Facebook groups that I belong to that are all gender critical. Another example is the cancelling of funding for women's organisations. I gave some money to a crowdfunding thing once, and we were told that the crowdfunding would not be allowed to continue and we would get our money back. Well, I've never got my money back, and I don't think anyone else I know has either. There's also the exclusion of women's groups from consulted reference groups. It's usually LGBTQ groups who are involved in the preparation of new legislation on SOGI conversion practices and self-ID for transgender identified people, and lots of other consultations that happen at the policy level. Nobody's really interested in lesbian-only groups on consulting with us. Another example is bullying and other forms of harassment, such as campus debates in Sydney and Melbourne. The one in Sydney that I went to for a couple of years ago, we were invaded by a whole lot of young people chanting in our faces and treating us like we were the enemy. It was humorous, but it was also disturbing. There's also the loss of accommodation by the Feminist Legal Clinic in Sydney, and the workplace bullying and intimidation of many gender critical women, such as Holly Lawford Smith, etc. There have been legal attacks using anti-discrimination laws, such as the attack against Beth Rep, a radio personality in the ACT, who was fined, I think, $10,000 for some small comments she made on a Facebook page, I think it was. What we're doing is we're speaking up. Lots of women, and you've heard tonight, lots of women are making submissions to inquiries, speaking up, trying to challenge the transgender movement and ideology. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little while, about a group I'm in. The second article is about the peaceful assembly and association of women. Today I was looking at a YouTube presentation by, well, it had Susan Hawthorne was one of the people who spoke, and she reminded us about a book she wrote coming from her thesis called In Defense of Separatism, which concludes with a call for women of all sexualities to have separate spaces so we can work together to change the world and end patriarchy. Isn't that a lovely thought? The other speaker was Nicole, who's looking after the Lesbian Lost Spaces project, which it gives an account of the impact of trans inclusion on the loss of lesbian spaces and culture. 102 lesbian spaces in Victoria alone were counted by the women in this project, and they can now only count 3 lesbian-only organisations today, from 102 to 3 in the whole of Victoria. That is shocking. And then, of course, is the whole issue of lesbian space. In Tasmania, Jessica Hoyle, a lesbian and member of the LGB Alliance Tasmania, made an application on behalf of the organisation to get legal permission to make their lesbian events single sex. The Anti-Discrimination Commissioner in Tasmania, Sarah Bolt, banned them from hosting lesbian events that exclude trans women on the grounds that such gatherings carry a significant risk of breaching existing equalities legislation. And that's a sad indictment on the changes that have been effected by the trans movement against legislation that used to protect us. There will be a final hearing on the 10th of March, and if they're unsuccessful, they will take the appeal to the High Court, and I'm looking forward to that battle. It's going to be very expensive. I think we'll all be digging in our pockets to support them. In Sydney, I was involved on the outskirts of the Lesbian Space Project. Can't remember, that was in the 80s, I think it was. Went to a wonderful fundraising concert in the Sydney Town Hall. Lots of women donated money. They set up a space in Newtown. And then I think someone was talking about it earlier. It all fell apart. Lots of anger, sadness, disappointment. A lot of lesbians walked away feeling very unhappy. Nevertheless, out of the ruins has come Link, which gives small amounts of funds to lesbians for various projects. So it's not all bad. And in Adelaide, Sappho's party, a private party advertised with flyers, hence considered a public event. And it wasn't allowed to go ahead. And after that, a lot of lesbian events went underground for quite a while. There's also been lesbian conferences and festivals that I've enjoyed, held in various capital cities. Brisbane was an eye-opener to me when a so-called trans woman arrived with an entourage of his supporters, of women, lesbians mainly. That was very controversial, and a lot of women were very distressed by that. The other lesbian conference and festival I went to was, I think, in 2011, and there was a fabulous concert at the Sydney Opera House. So we made our own women's space. Another area of women's space being invaded is the Mardi Gras and IWG. Trans supporters have committed violent acts. I think Chris could tell you a bit about that. And a lot of lesbians I know don't get involved in Mardi Gras anymore because of that. I used to enjoy going to women's dances and bars. I don't anymore. Could be my age as well. Other spaces are women's toilets. They've been mentioned earlier today. And of course, I don't think I've heard this mentioned, but women's services, rape crisis centres and DV shelters, they have suffered a lot from invasions from trans-identified men and women who support them. And let's not forget hospital wards and prisons and what's going on there. So I just want to move on to the final bit of my talk, which is to say that I'm a member of a number of lesbian, feminist, and gender critical online activist groups, such as 1040 Matrix, a New South Wales-based social lesbian organisation with the Older Dykes website. But my main commitment is to COAL, the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, which Chris mentioned earlier, where I'm a member of the National Committee. COAL is a not-for-profit national advocacy organisation, formed in 1994 to work towards ending discrimination against lesbians. And here I'd like to acknowledge Lavender, Sand and Jack in particular for the tremendous groundbreaking work that they had in setting that up and supporting the organisation, which was quite dynamic there for quite a while. The organisation is community-based and operates within a human rights and women-centric framework to protect lesbian human rights and to support lesbians across 6 state and 2 territory jurisdictions to participate in activities for positive social change. When the organisation formed, it was the only lesbian NGO holding accreditation with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, as well as the Division of the Advancement of Women. COAL is Australia's only lesbian-specific organisation that advocates on many issues to all levels of government. Last year, we funded a range of workshops with the aim of building the capacity of volunteers to contribute to the organisation and improve networking through training in computer-based skills, project organisation, media and community engagement. The project was inclusive of volunteers from other community networks, different age groups, those living in different states and in isolated regions. We're setting up a website, we're producing a newsletter, we provide speakers at conferences and other meetings and write submissions and reports. And some examples of those are submissions to the inquiries in Queensland, Victoria and Tasmania on SOGI conversion practices, the proposed federal religious discrimination bill. We made complaints to UN Women about violations of the human rights of women and girls in Australia, and the preparation and participation in the annual UN NGO Commission on the Status of Women Open Forum. It'll be held, it's held every year. COAL would very much like to increase our input into improving the lives of lesbians and expanding our membership to be more inclusive. I'd encourage any Australian lesbians watching and listening tonight to apply to become a member. Simply email us at coalitionofactivistlesbians, all lowercase, @gmail.com to ask for an application form. Membership rates are very reasonable, $5, $15 and $25, and you'll need to provide the name of a proposer who is known to COAL already. We have heard of efforts by LGBTQ activists to infiltrate our group, and we're careful to protect our organisation and membership from the unethical and bullying tactics of those pushing gender ideology. Thank you.